anyways,
That's okay.
that now. So my name is Jake De Bruin. I'm an agricultural engineer with OMAFRA. Actually, when I started with OMAFRA in 2001, the first primary thing I was working on was nutrient management. So that was back in the day before the regulation, when we had nutrient management plans just as part of the building permit process. And so in the early days of the NMAN software and so on. So I have, back to my earliest days in OMAFRA, I have a strong link to this program. So it's neat to see how the program has evolved and moved on and so on. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'll turn off my camera and shut off the camera there. Are you able to see my screen right now?
Yep.
Yes.
Awesome. Good. Okay. So so I'll be going through this. Matt, of course, is welcome to jump in. And actually, Lisa was heavily involved in the development of these regulations as well. And so I might lean on them in some of the questions and all that as well at the end. I see we're a little off timing here. I'll just proceed through the content reasonably quickly, and then lots of time for questions afterwards. So regulated mixed anaerobic digestion facilities. So these are anaerobic digesters. So I'll just give the quick walk through what an anaerobic digester is. So we've got these big tanks full of different feedstocks, manure, food waste, crop material. Our purpose in operating these digesters is to produce biogas. So biogas got methane or CH4 in it. In the kind of the new thing we're talking about now is renewable natural gas. So we're trying to get that methane, clean it up to pipeline natural gas quality. So we put it through a gizmo called an upgrader, and then we're injecting the natural gas into the natural gas pipeline. And that might just go to replace conventional natural gas. A big pathway on digester projects that have already developed is actually using that renewable natural gas as a low carbon vehicle fuel. So that's kind of the pathway for digesters out there. Here in Ontario, we have the most digesters of any province in Canada. This is for on-farm type digesters that I'm talking about. Of course, there's also digesters at sewage treatment plants. In terms of our on-farm digesters, there's a kind of a range of what they look like. So on the top left is a little $400,000 just manure-only digester that's at a dairy farm near Woodstock. And you know, they're just handling the dairy manure from 85 milking cows and replacing their own on-site electricity and just exporting a bit of electricity. The right-hand side there, that's the big Woolwich Bio-End digester in Elmira. So the one on the left is 20 kilowatts. The one on the right is 2,800 kilowatts. And so that facility takes all sorts of food waste, food processing materials, and so on. But the same thing, big tank full of biological materials. The two pictures at the bottom are of another digester in Oxford County. So that's got a mix of dairy manure and then off-farm materials. And so just in this case, just a single tank digester. They have a hopper feedstock system where they can add solid materials in. The stuff on the right we see is solid digestate. Most of the digestate or effluent material that we think about comes out as a liquid material. We've harvested a lot of the carbon. And so the liquid digestate comes out, looks a lot like sort of dark black, slightly more watery manure. And so that's kind of really quick sort of what the digester sort of context looks like. So this past year, July, we enacted new regulations for these regulated mixed anaerobic digester facilities, or RMADFs. So there was already opportunities in the digester for these RMADFs. So we are looking at expanding the opportunities to treat more feedstock in these digesters. So our goal was more manure and more off-farm materials. And the real purpose there was to pursue this renewable natural gas production. So most of our digesters in Ontario are electricity focused, and that was under the feed-in tariff electricity program, the Green Energy Act. But the big new opportunity coming down the road is this renewable natural gas. To make renewable natural gas economical, you just need a bigger digester. So all the gizmos to upgrade the gas, to connect to the gas pipeline and so on are just higher cost. And so they only make sense at larger digesters today. When we look at bringing more feedstock to a farm digester, then we also want to be aware of the additional environmental protections that we might want to see in place. So we have this sort of overall approach. As we increase the opportunity for more feedstock, we also increase the oversight and controls to mitigate potential risks. And so we'll see, I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of new rules. And these are rules that primarily apply to these new larger digesters or to digesters that receive source separated organics, SSO. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So this is, I'll kind of hit this all as a quick summary. There's a lot of content here and so on. And but it's overall, it's part of an open for business sort of package. So although it's actually more rules, it's more rules in the context of one of the really nice parts of these nutrient management regs for digesters is that it's a permit by rule process. So developers, as they look at this, at least they know the playing field really clearly. And the alternative, if somebody doesn't want to go down this path, of course, is to get an ECA, environmental compliance approval, through the Ministry of Environment. And that gives, the option for other flexibilities, but it also just has, a different level of review and timelines on it and costs and so on. So this is one of a suite of opportunities for approvals of digesters in the province. So the key focus on feedstock. So these digesters, we're feeding the digester every day, and we're generally, for the on-farm digesters, we're feeding manure and we're feeding off-farm materials. So we have a whole variety of off-farm materials. We talk about Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 and requiring different treatment. So overall, a key thing was to increase the amount of off-farm material that can be received at the digester. The former rules up until this year, a farm could receive 200 cubic meters per day. And we've increased that number to 400 cubic meters per day of off-farm material. And we increased the annual maximum from 10,000 to 40,000. So a farm facility could receive, more in one day and less in the other, so long as they stick with that 400 per day maximum limit. Of course, if you couldn't receive 400 every day, 365 days a year, that would get you a much bigger number than that 40,000. So we still have requirements for manure. So one of the principles in this thing has always been that we're operating mixed digesters. It's a regulated mixed digester. So we're mixing agricultural and non-agricultural material. And so we had sort of a 25% manure sort of threshold under the old rules, and we've maintained that. And so it's kind of backwards language, but we say of the off-farm material volume that you receive, you have to have 50% of that again as manure. So if I was receiving 100 cubic meters per day of off-farm material, I would have to receive at least 50 or use at least 50 cubic meters per day of manure. And the manure could be for my own farm or for other farms. We also have a minimum manure volume. So I could have as low as 5% manure in the digester. In that case, I could only have 10% off-farm materials. The other 85% might be made up from crop materials. So corn stover, corn silage, purpose-grown biomass crops. And we're seeing that a lot of interest in that in the renewable natural gas space to look at crop-based feedstocks as well. One of the things that sometimes digester developers, operators want to do is have different ratios of feedstocks in a tank. So they might want to just digest just their food waste in one tank on its own first, and then mix it with manure, or vice versa. And so we now have introduced flexibility to do that. So that each digester vessel on their own, if you have multiple digester vessels, they could have different ratios of feedstocks, so long as, for the whole facility, the limits above are being met. And so overall, there's opportunities here for non-manure ag feedstocks like energy crops as well that I mentioned. Okay, another new opportunity in these reg changes is to allow farms to receive a source separated organic material. So source separated organics, these are materials coming from municipalities, residential, kitchen waste, and so on. But we don't want to see the garbage truck from town driving out to the countryside directly. So these SSO materials have to go to an approved off-site facility where they're screened and debagged and so on prior to them being received at the farm. So that differs from our other off-farm materials, where food processing type byproducts can go directly from, say, the food processor to the farm. And these SSO materials have to come from a municipal stream where the municipal stream excludes diapers, sanitary products, and incontinence products. And so that's Some of the municipal streams, like here where I live in Guelph, those materials are prohibited from being part of the system. So there's still obviously, it all comes down to the homeowner and so on in terms of what they're doing. And so that we have multiple lines of defense, we then also, these materials go into those offsite facilities for pre-screening. We recognize that there's increased potential risk of plastics and foreign matter that comes from this residential source-separated organics material. So we've applied plastics and screen requirements and limits. And we recognize that this material has the potential for odor. And so one of the ways that, that we address that is that these materials actually have to be received at the farm in a liquid form. And so what that does is it promotes quicker digestion, it enables proper screening, and it fits best with the sort of how do we reduce risk sort of framework. So unlike our normal manure and food waste digesters, when a digester receives source-separated organics, there's also new limits on the anaerobic digestion output material. So we also apply these plastic, foreign, and pathogen limits to the output material. For the numbers that we've used in terms of the thresholds, we've used the NASM limits in terms of 0.5% dry weight basis plastics and the screen sizes. And so that applies sort of a consistent playing field in terms of the materials that might ultimately end up through this process and towards land application. So another concern as we look at bringing more off-farm materials and more on-farm materials to a single digester site is odor. So as we handle more materials, even if we're handling them with more odor controls, as we'll see in a moment, we want to make sure that we're dealing with risks of odor and reducing risks of odor effectively. So when a farm digester is receiving more than 10,000 cubic meters per year of off-farm material, so one of these new big ones, or receiving source-separated organics, there's a variety of odor rules. So the first is large setbacks. So most of our large livestock farms, under a minimum distance separation, they'll be achieving 200, 300, 400 meter setbacks. For these new large digesters, we've applied a 450 meter setback from neighboring houses, residential areas, and so on. For an existing farm digester, there's about 40 of them in the province now, we've carved out some opportunity for that existing farm digester to grow based on their existing infrastructure. But the way that it's worded, essentially they have to expand away from their neighbors so that we're reducing potential odor impacts there. We have requirements for odor capture and treatment systems with the term we use as an odor control system, engineer designed odor control system. And we're particularly focusing on odor from feedstock. So we know that as the materials arrive at the farm and mix together and so on, that's a primary area of concern for odor. And then we've put some constraints on the operation of the feedstock system. So sort of the best is that all the feedstocks are received in an enclosed building. So we don't see the trucks unloading materials outside and in the open. Or else if they're feeding into feedstock tanks outside, that these are closed feedstock tanks. And then we have some provisions in some cases for limited openings for solid feedstocks into a solid feedstock tank, the opportunity to dump a solid material. In order to equip our Ministry of Environment compliance officers with effective tools, we've created a rule that we call the significant odor emission rule. And that's so that we have an opportunity to address odors that are not characteristic of other odors we would see in the countryside. So most of the rules that I've talked about elsewhere here only apply to the digesters that are expanding above this 10,000 cubic meters per year level. But this significant odor emission rule will apply to any new anaerobic digester that is constructed after July 2021. And then the last is a new thing called an odor management plan. So you're all planners, and so an odor management plan is the same kind of stuff. It's what are your potential odor sources, and how are you going to mitigate those odor sources, and so on. The requirement is that odor management plan be developed with an engineer, and there's some guidance material on our website that instructs the process for what that should look like. So the biogas upgrader, this is the gizmo that cleans the biogas to pipeline quality. So biogas about 60% methane, and we want to get it up to 95% plus methane. So there's a few different systems that scrub the biogas to remove that carbon dioxide. So we recognize that the nutrient management regulation isn't an energy regulation. It's not about regulating energy systems. But of course, at a digester, we have either the cogen, the unit that produces electricity, or this upgrader. And so we had to put some boundaries around. So in particular, where biogas is going to be moving from multiple sites. So the requirements that we have in here, that this upgrader has to be located either on the same lot as the digester vessels or on an adjacent lot. The upgrader has to be close by to the digester vessel, and the biogas has to be from the same property or an adjacent property, and from that is owned by the same person that owns the upgrader. So what this means there in practice, there's a concept called the hub and spoke model, where there might be several smaller digesters that feed a central system, and it's not our intent to regulate the energy aspect of that under this regulation. If a developer was going to do this hub and spoke model, the digesters could be regulated mixed AV facilities, but that upgrader would be more considered an industrial activity, would require an ECA, air emission requirements, and so on from the Ministry of Environment. Okay, and then lastly is land application. So as some of you will recall, the digestate, or the regulation we call it anaerobic digestion output, it's considered an agricultural source material when it comes out of meets the requirements here of this regulation. And so in the case where you have a large livestock barn that has requirements for a nutrient management plan, and that's most of the farms that have anaerobic digesters right now, then we have these nutrient management planning requirements that also trigger for the digestate. But we also recognize that a number of large digesters just transfer out material. And there was a concern that we don't want to see very large anaerobic digesters getting constructed, managing very large volumes of materials, and then seeing this transfer out process and not seeing the type of oversight that we might want on the digestate material. So for these new greater than 10,000 cubic meter off-farm material digesters, or a digester that takes any source separated organic Schedule 2B material, if the facility doesn't already require a nutrient management plan, then we apply our standard 5-year agronomic rates that we already see in the regulations. And the new thing here is that these rate limits stick with the material even if they're transferred out. So there is no transfer out anymore, is essentially what that means. So these digesters, all of these materials will be subject to rate limits either under a nutrient management plan or the 5-year agronomic limits on phosphorus and nitrogen. We created 2 other categories of material to recognize the potential for what happens when I have a very large digester and the materials that might come out. So we've created something called RADO, Restricted Anaerobic Digestion Output. And so it's basically output when a digester has violated certain rules in the regulation. So, an example might be that the recipe is off and they're receiving more off-farm feedstock than they're supposed to. So the consequence, we still probably want to see that stuff be land applied in the countryside, but we needed some sort of consequence and oversight appropriate to the material and the volume of material. And so the outcome is that material becomes a Category 3 unlisted NASM. And so then obviously there's a different land application requirement, NASM plans, and so on that then come into force for a Category 3 unlisted NASM. Another material that we recognize is cleanout material. So this is material that accumulates maybe in the bottom of the digester over time. So there's grit and little bits of glass and metal and stuff that might have come in particular with source separated organics material. And that stuff will settle in the digester, may settle in the digester over time. So for the most part, that material probably should just go to landfill. But there might be, in some circumstances, we see other more agricultural digesters that there's clean out material that really is just grit and bones and stuff like that, and is relatively innocuous and should be could be land applied. And so we apply these same foreign object and plastic rules to that clean out material in an explicit way. So that's it. That's the real quick run through of that. I'll hand this over to Matt to talk about what it's going to look like in terms of a nutrient management strategy for this material. Over to you, Matt.
Excellent. Thanks, Jake. Thanks for that that overview. The digester stuff is definitely quite complicated in the regulation, and not necessarily as complicated on the ground when you know what the size and things of the digester and the materials going in. And Jake, you did a great job explaining it there. So I just wanted to give a quick, it's just one slide. So anybody certified to do a nutrient management strategy is certified to do a strategy with a regulated mixed AD in it. So most people on this call, you may have the opportunity to do a strategy with one of these digesters, and just a contact me early on in the process, I guess would be the best way to say it, especially for these first ones. We haven't seen one of these large digesters come in yet. There's been about 20 or so strategies that came in with the old digester rules. The new rules, like I say, are complicated because depending on what materials the digester will be receiving, in some cases the amount that they'll be receiving, it depends what rules apply to that digester. So there's quite a bit of stuff we're going to need above and beyond what normally goes into a strategy. So probably the best thing that you'll need to do is do a separate RMADF overview, which covers all of the components that the digester will cover, the rules that the digester will cover, and then after that, the rest of it's relatively straightforward, close to what you're used to doing. There'll be extra volumes that you're entering into AgriSuite, and obviously those volumes will carry through for storage and things like that. But we do have a separate checklist that we've put together. I'm not going to share it today, but and mostly just because it's draft and it may change once we get through a few strategy reviews that have these large digesters. I just don't want to get kind of old versions out there, but it's definitely something we can share when you're working on a strategy that has a digester in it. I know some consultants are working very closely with the engineers that are designing the digester, and basically, passing over the checklist and saying, this is what I'm going to need to include in the strategy. Can you prepare something for me? And we sometimes get a nice document from the engineer just really laying out how it meets the regulations, and that's kind of the best case scenario, is when we can very clearly see, this is what the reg says, this is the design, this is how it's going to meet the requirements of the regulation. With these large digesters, definitely comes some concern, just because there's a lot of material potentially going to a site. So we need to make sure we're doing our due diligence to make sure that as much of the information that we can confirm up front, we do that in the strategy review process. So we will be looking closely at these ones, and there's a lot of information that we're going to need to make sure that the design, the plan is to meet all the requirements of the regulation. So just a caution there, nothing you should be necessarily scared of. Normally these would be fairly large livestock facilities that will be bringing a fairly large amount of off-farm material. So it would be a bigger strategy that you would be working with. And so just a bit of caution, but we're here to help. Jake, myself, more than happy to kind of provide some guidance along the way if needed. So I'll leave it at that. We do have like I say, a checklist. It's about 14 pages by the time you get through all the requirements. And again, a lot of it is just because there's a lot of rules that apply in different places depending on the size and the volumes of materials coming in. I'll stop there.
And I understand we're going to do questions and answers later at the end, and I will just be rolling back in at 3:35 for that, so I'll miss the first couple of minutes, but I'll be here for questions. But I don't know, Jen, do we want to do a couple now, or do you want to get back on schedule with Dale and do questions at the end?
No, we're on track. My schedule was very vague, so I think anybody who has questions about this presentation, ask it now.
Great.
And Jake, just one last thing. You're working on kind of a plain language guide for the digesters. Is that still correct?
Yeah,
I
that's
will
right.
be-
Actually, and
Oh,
it's
okay.
yeah. So we will have a plain language guide that kind of describes regulations and flows through it in sort of a nice linear fashion. And we have sort of the final draft of that from legal. So hey, Lisa, stay tuned. I'll be sending that out later this week to you. So we're just finalizing that. We have to get it translated and so on, and then we will have that will be out there real soon. In the meantime, like as Matt and I mentioned, we're having a few conversations early on with digester developers and their nutrient management consultants, so that when these fully come in, we're actively walking along with people on this. I guess the other quick point is that for the digester sector, the rules that we're talking about here and so on, just build on that existing framework that was already there. And so it seems like a lot of rules, but it's also workable. So working with the farmer, this is all stuff that kind of fits. So it's not like they have to kind of squeeze themselves backwards and upside down to make it all work. So it all is sort of logical and practical for the farm, despite the volume of what you see here of stuff. At least that's our hope and intent, and based on the feedback that we've received thus far. Janet, any questions there in the chat or feedback or anything?
I don't see any. I haven't a comment. You're making a plain language document that is being vetted through the legal department. Seems a little like an oxymoron, but
it's well, you folks know just the legal aspect of the stuff is incredible. So it's important to get it right. It's important that our direction and guidance is both clear and correct. So it's always a balance there to communicate that clearly.
yeah. Good.